So let's get them, come along then, and I'll wear my Russian shirt. So let's raise our fists together, and let's have someone get hurt. Okay, they got the money, but we have got the looks. Okay, they got the money, but we have better books we actually read. I said fuck you, we don't need you, let's bomb the bourgeoisie. We are happy and you can't be, let's bomb the bourgeoisie and come with me. They have Parsies and Mercedes and they draw them out to school, but they fail in every subject, they pretended that it's cool. But they don't have to care about their future life, because their daddy's gonna buy them everything until he dies. I said fuck you, we don't need you, let's bomb the bourgeoisie. We are happy and you can't be, let's bomb the bourgeoisie and come with me. So fuck you, we don't need you, let's bomb the bourgeoisie. We are happy and you can't be, let's bomb the bourgeoisie and come with me. Come with me, come with me, come with me.
You're listening to Radical Minds here on WHPK 88.5 FM. The Civil War ushered in the Second American Revolution. This was the most momentous event in the entire 19th century, for out of it came the capitalist colossus of our own day. The Emancipation Proclamation was the greatest event in that conflict. Its significance and shortcomings cannot be understood except in the context of the Civil War and the divergent interests and aims of the social forces on the winning side. Ever since the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the moving force in American history and the pivot of its political affairs had been the now muffled, now acute struggle for supremacy between the beneficiaries of slave labor and the upholders of free soil and free labor. Just as the rule of big business is central to the problems of our generation, so throughout the first half of the 19th century the major social issue before the American people was, what is to be done about the slave power? So wrote socialist George Novak 50 years ago to mark the centenary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Today, 150 years after a revolutionary milestone and turning point of the Civil War, celebrations are more muted. There is an exhibition of photos at the New York Public Library, and the federal government has issued a new stamp, but on the whole, the anniversary is passing largely without notice. Of course, there is Steven Spielberg's recent Academy Award-nominated film Lincoln, but in it, discussions of the proclamation don't necessarily arise, since the event the film treats directly is the definitive abolition of slavery in the United States by the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. It is the passage of that amendment through Congress that provides a dramatic subject matter for Spielberg's film. But here on Radical Minds, we do not forget the revolutionary past. Here to help us mark this historic anniversary, as well as Spielberg's blockbuster film, is historian James McPherson. James M. McPherson is the George Henry Davis 86th Professor Emeritus of United States History at Princeton University and a recipient of the Pulitzer Prize for his masterful one-volume history of the American Civil War, The Battle Cry of Freedom. In 2003, Professor McPherson served as president of the American Historical Association, and in 2009 he was co-winner of the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize for Tried by War, Abraham Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief. We are pleased to have Professor McPherson joining us today.
Greetings, Professor McPherson.
Well, thank you for having me on this program.
It's wonderful to have you on Radical Minds. Let me begin by asking you about the Emancipation Proclamation. 150 years ago, on the 1st of January, 1863, President Lincoln issued his famous Emancipation Proclamation. This constituted an important culmination in the long struggle for the abolition of slavery in the United States. what, in brief, is the background to the proclamation in terms of the long struggle for free labor in North America, stretching back to the Revolution and into colonial times? Was the destruction of slavery in America simply a matter of coming to terms with an original American sin or lingering hypocrisy? Or had the course of history in the 19th century posed the question of chattel slavery in a way that it had not done for the generation of the American Enlightenment and Revolution?
Well, in the first place, slavery was not a uniquely American sin. Slavery had existed in many societies over many centuries. Mm-hmm. And that was true, of course, in colonial America when slaves were first introduced into Virginia in 1619, and in subsequent decades, slavery took deep root in all of the British North American colonies, as well as in the Caribbean and South America, where, in fact, slavery was much more deeply entrenched than it was in most parts of North America. But starting in the, I think probably one would say the third quarter of the 18th century, as a variety of forces began to call the morality and validity of slavery into question. Cultural forces, intellectual forces, economic forces, the Enlightenment, the generation of or the age of revolution, as it has been called, with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, revolutions in Latin America, which began to attack the philosophical and economic underpinnings of slavery. In the northern states that formed the new American nation, the revolution really began a powerful anti-slavery movement, which by about 1800 had eliminated slavery, or had begun to eliminate slavery from all of the states north of the Mason-Dixon line. The Haitian Revolution, beginning in the 1790s, liberated that island by exceeding violence. But there was a gathering movement against slavery in the Western world, that, of course, had its effect in the United States, and the beginning of a fairly strong anti-slavery movement, first among the Quakers, then spreading into other parts of the North and even the South as well, which really, I guess, reached a kind of culmination in the 1830s with the beginning of what's often called a militant abolitionist movement. William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, the founding of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And gradually that impulse spread into a political movement, first with the Liberty Party in 1840, and then the Free Soil Party in 1848, and the Republican Party in the middle 1850s, which developed what historian Eric Foner talked about many decades ago now as a free labor ideology, that really created a sense of two socioeconomic orders in the United States. One in the northern states based on free labor, with social mobility, with kind of dynamic entrepreneurial society. But at the same time, slavery in the South had become more deeply entrenched since the 1780s, when there was a fairly widespread sense that slavery would disappear. In fact, I think the founding fathers, so-called, who formed the Constitution in 1787, assumed that slavery would soon die out, and they were willing to make certain compromises with the slave states to get them to join this new nation and to ratify the Constitution on the assumption that slavery probably would die out soon. But in fact, quite the opposite happened in the South, starting, I think, with the 1790s and early 1800s with the spread of the Cotton Kingdom, which meant that in the very decades that slavery was disappearing from the North and a strong anti-slavery movement was developing, in the first half of the 19th century, the institution, for economic reasons primarily, was becoming much more deeply entrenched in the South, and that generated a whole series of cultural and social and political justifications for the institution of slavery, which meant that by the middle of the 19th century, the two sections had come to a kind of face-off with each other over the question of the expansion of slavery into new territories, which was made an acute problem by the acquisition of a huge amount of new territory in the Mexican War, and then a bitter struggle starting in 1854 over the territories that had originally been acquired in the Louisiana Purchase back in 1803. But now the whole question of whether slavery would be allowed to expand into those territories that had not yet become states becomes acute in the middle 1850s. So I think that in a sense the anti-slavery impulse, which had deep roots going back into the latter part of the 18th century and had spread, was coming into a collision course with a pro-slavery impulse, which had become pretty powerful, I think, by the 1830s and 1840s in the slave states. And so that led to, of course, the showdown in 1860 with Lincoln's election and the secession of the southern states.
So you're saying that at the time of the revolution for independence and later with the formation of the Constitution, at that time there wasn't complacency respecting the institution of slavery, but there were rather expectations that it would die out, and in fact it was abolished at the state level in parts of the North or throughout the North, and that to a degree those expectations were unrealistic, that they weren't able to foresee the kind of changes that, for instance, the cultivation of cotton for industrial textile production began to have in the South.
That's quite true, and I think there's a real irony there, because the kinds of economic changes that drove the Industrial Revolution, first in Britain and then in the northern United States, and generated a kind of free labor ideology. Those industrial changes also encouraged the growth of cotton in the South, because the textile industry was the kind of cutting edge of that economic change in the late 18th and early 19th century. So that entrenched slavery more deeply in the South, at the same time that it was generating a kind of free labor entrepreneurial ideal and ideology in the North.
Right. Okay. The next question really gets to the kind of the specificity of the Emancipation Proclamation in its own moment. As Lincoln noted in 1862, prior to issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, "I don't want to issue a document that the whole world will see must necessarily be inoperative, like the Pope's bull against the comet." Was Lincoln dilatory in issuing the Emancipation Proclamation? And what was the specific import of it in the ongoing process of the war's destruction of slavery as a military project ongoing? And finally, What was the significance of the proclamation's lifting of the ban on the enlistment of black soldiers in the Union Army?
Well, that's a complex set of questions. Let me see if I can disentangle them a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
From the very beginning of the war, I think Lincoln had to walk a narrow path between the forces that were moving in the direction of the erosion of slavery, which began at the very start of the war, I think. The moment that the first Northern soldier set foot in the South, he became an agent of emancipation, even if an unwitting one and an unintentional one, because slaves started flocking to Union lines, and the Lincoln administration very early made a commitment not to return them to slavery. So starting on the Virginia Peninsula at Fortress Monroe in May of 1861 and expanding through many parts of the Confederacy as Union naval and army forces began to penetrate the Confederacy, thousands, tens of thousands of slaves came within Union lines. And the Lincoln administration quite early had made the decision that they would not be returned. First, they would not be returned to owners who were supporting the Confederacy, but by the late summer or the fall of 1861, even in the border states that remained loyal to the Union, slaves were not being returned to masters unless they could prove, which turned out often to be a very difficult process, could prove that they were loyal to the United States, and sometimes not even then. And Congress began passing legislation, first a Confiscation Act in August of 1861, which said that masters whose slaves had worked to support the Confederate war effort but escaped to Union lines, those masters had forfeited the rights to their slaves. In fact, what that meant was that the slaves had become free. In March 1862, Congress passed a legislation which Lincoln signed that prohibited Union Army officers from returning slaves to their masters, whether those masters were loyal or not, and whether this process took place in the Confederacy or in the loyal border slave states. That's one side of what's happening on the ground in the Civil War and in the form of legislation in Washington. On the other side is Lincoln's concern to maintain a coalition to support this war effort that included Northern Democrats and border state Unionists, both groups of which did not see this as a war against slavery, but as a war to restore the Union. The Union of 1861, a union in which slavery existed in half the country, and threatened to bail out from support of this war for the Union if it became overtly and explicitly a war against slavery. So Lincoln had to walk that path. And so, in the first year and a half of the war, he sustained these steps that I described a moment ago, by which thousands of slaves did, in fact, achieve freedom, but at the same time, not to make clear that this was not a war for the abolition of slavery, but a war to preserve the Union, and any effort, any steps that eroded slavery were just a byproduct of this war to defend the Union. But increasingly, I think in the summer of 1862, especially when the Confederates launched several counteroffensives that had ended the hopes of Union victory that had spread in early 1862 with widespread Union success in several theaters of the war. By the summer of 1862, it was clear that wasn't going to happen, and the Confederacy was roaring back. And it also became increasingly clear that slave labor in the Confederacy was sustaining the Southern economy, the war economy, that slaves provided much of the essential labor for the logistical efforts of the Confederate Army. They were essential as laborers for the Confederate armies. That a more overt strike against slavery as a military necessity, to cite the phrase that was used over and over again in the North in 1862, that it was necessary to undermine the Confederate war effort to strike overtly against slavery. Congress passed a more comprehensive Confiscation Act in July of 1862, and at that same time, in July 1862, Lincoln decided to issue a proclamation freeing the slaves in parts of the Confederacy that were at war with the United States, which went way beyond the earlier partial steps by which slaves who came within Union lines had achieved freedom. Okay. He was dissuaded from making this overt proclamation at first, at a time when Union armies were reeling back in defeat. It would look like a desperate measure, maybe a measure to incite a slave insurrection. Mm-hmm. So he withheld it until after Union arms won a victory, a limited one, but a significant one nevertheless, at Antietam in September 1862, and 5 days later issued a proclamation which stated his intention to issue a final proclamation on January 1st, 1863, that would apply to all parts of the Confederacy that had not yet come under Union control or had not returned to the Union. And of course, that was most of the Confederacy, and Lincoln did issue this proclamation on January 1st. So that was really a culmination of a process that went back to the beginning of the war, and in some ways, of course, went back decades to kind of a climax of many decades of arguing against slavery, of movement to abolish it or at least to restrict its power. I think the Emancipation Proclamation had a powerful symbolic as well as substantive impact. It now announced that one of the goals of the war was to bring an end to slavery. Maybe not everywhere and maybe not immediately, but it was a much more dramatic statement of that purpose than anything that had gone before. And as you suggested, it also lifted what had previously been, in effect, a ban on the enlistment of African Americans in the Union Army, and it announced an explicit intention to recruit freed slaves into the Union Army. So it added another arrow to the quiver of the Northern war effort, and in the end, eventually, about 200,000 African Americans, most of them former slaves, fought in the Union Army and Navy, and as Lincoln himself said on several occasions, made an important and even essential contribution to the Union war effort. So in some ways, that may have been the most important part of the Emancipation Proclamation, because now the slaves could not only achieve their own freedom by coming within Union lines, but could be armed to fight for their own freedom and for the freedom of the entire slave population.
Let me take up this question of the sort of the symbolic significance of the proclamation. It's an aspect of it that's little remarked upon now, but the Emancipation Proclamation in its own day was in some ways as much directed at Europe as it was at Richmond and the plantations of the South. On the day the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Lincoln, Horace Greeley, editor of what was then the leading Republican newspaper in the country, the New York Tribune, wrote, "Our European friends have all desired and hoped that we would take ground against that mother of sedition, that fruitful source of all of our woes, slavery. Victor Hugo, Garibaldi, John Bright, every recognized and honored leader of the Party of Progress had impatiently anticipated the proclamation of freedom. The policy of emancipation has won to our cause some valued friends over the water. We do not hear that it has lost us one." And the Civil War writings of Karl Marx, many of which were written in his capacity as London correspondent for the same New York paper, repeatedly decry the open or at least tacit sympathy for the Confederacy in governing circles, in London especially. Why was the militarily enforced emancipation of slaves, or that project's failure, significant on an international plane? And what was the significance of the Emancipation Proclamation in, as it were, world history?
Well, at one level, it was significant in precluding foreign intervention in the American Civil War. Most civil wars throughout history, and we can think of examples in our own time, Libya last year, Syria right now, and throughout history, most civil wars have attracted foreign intervention on one side or the other. And there was a real possibility that might happen in the American Civil War. And if that had happened, it certainly would have helped the Confederacy, because any kind of intervention is usually on the side of the rebellious rather than the established power. As happened in Libya, and as in some ways is either happening or is likely to happen in Syria.
And I didn't mention it, but there were French armies also on the borders of the Confederacy.
That's right. France had intervened and ultimately sent 35,000 troops to Mexico and installed the Archduke Maximilian of Austria on the Mexican throne in 1864, and so and the Confederates were reaching out to the French and to Maximilian in the hope that they might provide some assistance to the Confederacy in return for Confederate recognition of France's Maximilian's reign in Mexico. That never happened, but that was a real danger. But the primary fear of the North and hope of the South was British intervention. And as Karl Marx said, there was a lot of sympathy in many circles in Britain, especially among the gentry and the aristocracy, for the Confederacy. But there was also a countervailing trend in Britain of hostility to slavery. The British had abolished slavery themselves in their West Indian colonies back in 1833, and at that time it was the largest emancipation at one time in the history of the world. And within the British working class and middle-class liberals, there was a lot of sympathy for the North, because the United States had been seen by British workers and British supporters of greater democratization of British society. The United States had been viewed for a generation or more before the Civil War as a kind of exemplar of democracy, but with a kind of tragic flaw, and that tragic flaw was slavery. And as long as the North was not openly and overtly fighting a war against slavery, but only for the restoration of the Union, it was difficult for those British liberals and radicals to argue that the Britain should not intervene against the United States and in favor of the Confederacy, despite the cutoff of cotton by the war, which had caused a kind of economic crisis in Britain. But once Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, that tragic flaw had been removed, and the British liberals, British working class, could now openly celebrate their support of the Union, and British sympathizers with the Confederacy could no longer use that argument that this was only a war for dominion and not a war for freedom, as a way of trying to say the Confederacy that the Union was no better than the Confederacy, and that Britain ought to intervene in order to get cotton, sustain a people, the Confederates, fighting for self-government and so on. And clearly, as you suggested, the concern about British opinion in particular, but European opinion more broadly, was a factor in Lincoln's decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and certainly one major consequence of that proclamation was the definitive end to any possibility of British intervention, because now such intervention would have been seen as supporting slavery against freedom.
I want to take up a theme that really dominates your work, Tried by War, but also runs throughout the battle cry of freedom, and that's with respect to the actual military, the political character of the military conflict. One misconception respecting the American Civil War is in regards to its character as a military conflict. For instance, I myself, as a school child, was often told that the North had inferior military commanders, but this leaves aside the different task of the military commanders of the North and the South. The Civil War was political not only in its aims, but in its conduct. How does the Emancipation Proclamation grow out of and feed back into the conduct of the war by the Union Army? And I know you've already dealt with that somewhat in the lead up to the proclamation, but how does it also help to transform the struggle in such a way as to, in a sense, culminate in the appointment of Ulysses S. Grant as the commander of the Union armies and the definitive transition to the hard war of the final years? To take a line from the Spielberg film, how did Lincoln's leadership, the Republican Party, and Grant's army to enable each other to do terrible things?
Well, in some ways, all wars are politics, and politics and the military are inextricably intertwined. Karl von Clausewitz made this point in his famous statement in his book, Vom Kriege, on war, that war is the continuation of politics or policy by other means, and that's especially true in a civil war, like the American Civil War, which of course had been had broken out because of political differences and a political breakdown in the political process. And Lincoln was well aware that as President of the United States, as leader of the Republican Party, and as Commander-in-Chief of the United States armies, he was fulfilling both a political and a military role, and that they could not really be separated from each other. For one thing, he had to maintain the support of the people for the war effort. Otherwise, they would not. The armies would not have been able to be mobilized and would not have been supported. And so Every action that he took was with one eye to its military utility, but another eye to its political sustainability. And in the early part of the war, I think he was trying to maintain a united coalition of Republicans, of Northern Democrats, and of border state Unionists for this war effort, and was afraid that any radical steps against slavery would fracture that coalition. But as the war went on, I think that equation began to change in his mind and in the Northern polity. There became a louder and louder demand from the principal part of that political constituency, the Republican Party, for bolder action against slavery to crush the rebellion, bolder action against rebels and traitors, take their property. This is, and of course, the principal form of their property were slaves. So as the war emerged into a more bitter and harder conflict in the second year of the war, 1862, the weight of politics became increasingly that of not merely restoring the Union, but undermining the basis of disunion, which was slavery, the slave power, by striking against that power and striking against slavery. And so Lincoln became less and less concerned about maintaining the united support of the various parts of that war coalition, and more concerned about striking against the strength of the enemy, which was slavery and the slave power. And that shifting in the equation of the politics meant that a similar shift in the action of the military. In the first year or so of the war, Northern generals tried to avoid destruction of, and Lincoln himself, destruction of property in the South, tried to conciliate or win back the support of Southern whites for the Union. But as it became increasingly clear that this policy of conciliation, soft war, if you will, was not working, especially in the summer of 1862 as the Confederacy came storming back from an earlier series of defeats. The pressure to wage war, take the gloves off. One of the most frequently used metaphors in soldiers' letters, newspaper editorials, political speeches in the North in 1862 was to take off the kid gloves. Take off the gloves and turn this into a really hard war against traitors. Quit trying to conciliate these traitors and crush them. That kind of language became increasingly common in the dialogue in the North in the summer of 1862, and as that language became more common, so did the actions of Union armies in the South. And the movement to abolish slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation, and some of the congressional confiscation legislation moved in tandem with that change in public opinion and with the actual behavior of Union armies in the South. So the transition from a General George McClellan or General Don Carlos Buell, who were two of the principal Union commanders up until the fall of 1862, and who went out of their way to avoid hard war measures in the South, the transition from that to generals like Sherman and Sheridan and Grant in 1864, whose policy was to destroy anything that sustained the Confederate war effort, whether it be railroads or farms or slavery, was a really sharp change, not only in military behavior but in the kind of political will that sustained what became a war, not to restore the old Union, but in effect to destroy the infrastructure of the Confederacy and build a new Union on its ruins.
I want to take up this question of Lincoln as his development politically, and the way that the film, Steven Spielberg's film Lincoln, handles that. The recent film Lincoln addresses Lincoln the politician rather than Lincoln the plaster saint or Lincoln the log-splitting everyman. This raises the question of the nature of Lincoln's and more generally the Republican Party's political leadership during the war. I want to play two brief clips from Spielberg's movie. The first is Lincoln's backroom colloquy with Thaddeus Stevens during a party at the White House, respecting, in effect, the relation between war aims, strategy, and tactics. And the second is Lincoln's disquisition to his cabinet regarding the necessity of the passage of the 13th Amendment, in which he remarks that the hardest thing in politics is to recognize what is required in the here and now. Now, of course, I know these are words written by the screenwriter Tony Kushner, but it's a question sort of the accuracy, not in the costumes or the like, but the accuracy of the portrayal, the essence of the politics. Allow me to play you these two clips and have you comment on Lincoln in his dual role, as you say, as leader of the Republican Party and, of course, the civilian chief executive and as commander-in-chief during the Civil War.
Since we have the floor next in the debate, I thought I'd suggest you might temper your contribution so as not to frighten our conservative friends.
Ashley insists you're ensuring approval by dispensing patronage to otherwise undeserving Democrats.
Well, I can't ensure a single damn thing if you scare the whole House silly with talk of land appropriations and revolutionary tribunals.
When the war ends, I intend to push for full equality, the Negro vote, and much more. Congress shall mandate the seizure of every foot of rebel land and every dollar of their property. We'll use their confiscated wealth to establish hundreds of thousands of free Negro farmers, and at their side, soldiers armed to occupy and transform the heritage of traitors. The nation needs to know that we have such plans.
That's the untempered version of Reconstruction.
The people elected me to represent them, to lead them, and I lead. You ought to try it.
I admire your zeal, Mr. Stevens, and I have tried to profit from the example of it. But if I'd listened to you, I'd have declared every slave free the minute the first shell struck Fort Sumter. Then the border states would have gone over to the Confederacy, the war would have been lost, and the Union along with it. And instead of abolishing slavery, as we hope to do in 2 weeks, we'd be watching helpless as infants as it spread from the American South into South America.
Oh, how you have longed to say that to me. You claim you trust them, but you know what the people are. You know that the inner compass that should direct the soul toward justice has ossified in white men and women, North and South, unto utter uselessness through tolerating the evil of slavery.
A compass I learned when I was surveying. It'll point you true north from where you're standing, but it's got no advice about the swamps, deserts and chasms that you'll encounter along the way. If in pursuit of your destination you plunge ahead heedless of obstacles and achieve nothing more than to sink in a swamp, what's the use of knowing true north? I can't listen to this anymore. I can't accomplish a goddamn thing of any human meaning or worth until we cure ourselves of slavery and end this pestilential war. And whether any of you or anyone else knows it, I know I need this. This amendment is that cure. We're stepped out upon the world stage now, with the fate of human dignity in our hands. Blood's been spilt to afford us this moment, now. And you grousel and heckle and dodge about like pettifogging Tammany Hall hucksters. See what is before you. See the here and now. That's the hardest thing, the only thing that accounts. These votes must be procured.
What of Lincoln's political greatness does the film get at?
Well, in the colloquy with Thaddeus Stevens, Lincoln, on the one hand, is paying tribute to Stevens' leadership as the most radical of the Republicans, who, from the very beginning of the war, had insisted that this war must be a war to destroy slavery and the planter class in the South, and who has frequently, and in this colloquy, is expressing impatience with Lincoln's what Stevens would have seen as Lincoln's dilatory and gradualist approach to the whole question. On his part, Lincoln is paying tribute to Stevens's. Stevens knows what the goal of the war ought to be, and of course this conversation is taking place in January 1865, and so a lot of water has gone over the dam by that time. Stevens is the one who pointed out the true north that the compass has pointed to, that is a total victory and destruction of slavery. And by the way, I think, although probably nothing like this conversation ever really took place, Kushner is picking up on something that was important about Lincoln's methods of communication. He frequently would use a metaphor to make a point, and here he's doing that by the metaphor of a compass, and it indicates the direction in which we want to go. It tells you where true north is, but it tells you nothing about the obstacles that you will find along the way: mountains, swamps, deserts. And what Lincoln is saying is that, as president, I'm glad that you showed me where we need to go. You've made an important contribution. But if we had followed your advice and it had just blindly struck out at the beginning of the war for the true north point in that compass, we would have lost the war. We would have lost the border states. We would have lost the Northern Democrats. We would have lost the support of the people. As president and commander-in-chief and leader of the Republican Party, it's my responsibility to figure out how to get around those swamps and over those mountains. And that's what we've been doing in the last 3.5 years, and it's brought us this far. And the 13th Amendment, which I'm hoping Congress is going to pass in a couple of weeks, will bring us almost to the final end of that journey. So I think it's kind of a brilliant scene in the movie that shows Lincoln's leadership style and its contrast with Thaddeus Stevens' leadership style. Both of them were important, and both were necessary. And I think that's the point of this scene. But Lincoln's brilliance was to recognize how to implement Stevens' vision. In the scene with the cabinet, I thought that was less true to the reality of Lincoln's relationship to the cabinet. It tends to portray the cabinet as dragging their feet,
right,
and as conservative and reluctant to move ahead on this effort to get the 13th Amendment passed, and I don't think that was really true. in January 1865. Most members of the cabinet were fully committed to this policy. But I think that Kushner is using this scene, nevertheless, to make a point that is an historically valid point. That is, Lincoln was using several methods to try to achieve this goal. One was the backroom politicking that the movie portrays so well. The deals that had to be made to get some Democratic representatives to vote for the 13th Amendment, the promises that had to be made, the patronage that had to be distributed or promised. It also shows some of the scenes in the movie had shown Lincoln trying to use his persuasive power, making moral arguments, humanitarian arguments. But the scene with the cabinet is Lincoln as commander-in-chief demanding that this step has to be taken. We have to accomplish this no matter what it takes to do it. He's demanding that here and now is the time. We can't wait any longer. We can't just keep kicking it, to use a contemporary metaphor that is much in the news right now. We can't keep kicking this can down the road. We must act now. Mm-hmm. We must act decisively. And I think that's another component of Lincoln's leadership, the matter of timing. There are times when you have to kick the can down the road, you have to delay, you have to prevaricate, you have to make backroom deals, but there also comes a time when you need to step up to the plate and do what it takes to accomplish this. Mm-hmm. So I think the scene is a very effective one, even though it's not true to the historical reality of Lincoln's cabinet in 1865.
Beyond Lincoln's presidency, of course,
Want to have some fun with history? Log on to americaslibrary.gov. It's history the way kids like it. Cool films, pictures, startling facts, all just a click away from your home, school, or local library. americaslibrary.gov. Log on, play around, learn something. I'd also like to announce the upcoming issue of the PR will be available online on February 1st. It will contain this interview along with many other interesting articles about the history of the left.
I want to say a bit about anticipating the post-war. Beyond Lincoln's presidency, of course, lay peace and Reconstruction. But here it seems that the contrast between war and peace threatens to obscure underlying political continuities. How did Reconstruction arise as a consequence of the war? We've been talking, for instance, about the connection between the conduct of the war by the Union Army and the political project that emerged of suppressing the slaveholders' rebellion against the federal government. How did Lincoln's acceptance of the emancipatory logic of the war shape the subsequent project of Reconstruction?
Well, Reconstruction became an extremely thorny problem for Lincoln, but even more so for his successors. And I think the reason, or at least one reason for that, is that Reconstruction, the word Reconstruction had two meanings in the contemporary usage, and sometimes they were in conflict with each other. In one sense, Reconstruction meant to reconstruct the Union. To bring the southern states back into the Union, to end the war, and to knit the United States together again as one nation, rather than the two nations it had been ever since secession back in 1861. But the other meaning of Reconstruction was to reconstruct Southern society. Now that slavery was gone, what was freedom going to mean? What was going to be the status of the freed slaves? What was their relationship with their former owners going to be in this reconstructed union? And that became the main problem faced by the country for for many decades in some ways, but for certainly a dozen years after the end of the war, from 1865 to 1877, when federal troops were stationed in the former Confederate states as the agents to enforce Reconstruction. But sometimes these two meanings of Reconstruction came into conflict with each other. One way to reconstruct the United States was a degree of forgiveness, of amnesty, of conciliation toward former enemies, that is, the Confederates, in order to entice them to become loyal Americans again. But what would be the fate of the freed slaves if you restored through conciliation, through amnesty, their former masters, their former Confederates, without any safeguards to protect the freedom of the slaves from some kind of new slavery, reimposed quasi-slavery? So basically the Republican majority in Congress, that policy of conciliation was the policy that President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, tried to undertake, and he could invoke some of Lincoln's legacy, and did try to invoke some of Lincoln's legacy. Lincoln had issued a proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction back in December 1863. In his second inaugural address, he had talked about forgiveness and reconciliation. And President Andrew Johnson tried to implement that side of Reconstruction to bring the southern states back into the Union as quickly and as easily and painlessly as possible. But the Republican majority in Congress rejected that approach. And I think Lincoln would have come to reject it too, as he saw what was happening if he had lived in 1865 and 1866, and tried to write a number of safeguards of to protect the freedom and expand the civil and eventually political rights of the freed slaves. And that led to a decade, really, of violence and conflict in the South, which in some ways reversed the aphorism of Karl von Clausewitz. Now the politics of Reconstruction became a continuation of the war in many ways, and organizations like the Ku Klux Klan of former Confederate soldiers came into conflict with Union leagues in the South, organizations of blacks, including some former black soldiers. The degree of violence that took place in some of the southern states during Reconstruction was in some ways a continuation of the war. And so Reconstruction became a very troubled and controversial and violent process. And whether Lincoln could have provided the kind of leadership in his second term, had he lived, to avoid the worst of that, is unknowable. But I personally think that he might have, if anybody could have done it, he could have. He could have brought these two different meanings of Reconstruction together in some kind of way that would have protected the rights of freedmen at the same time as providing some degree of conciliation of Southern whites. That's what he had hoped to do and what he was trying to do in his amnesty and Reconstruction program that he had announced back in December of 1863, but never had a chance to try to see if he could carry it out.
Let me ask you one more question about the vicissitudes of historiography and the most recent legacy of civil rights in the 1960s. You're of a generation of historians that emerged in the immediate wake of the civil rights movement. to be somewhat schematic, with the eventual split of that movement into Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin on the one side representing liberal integrationism, and Stokely Carmichael and Huey P. Newton, among others, on the other side representing an ostensibly revolutionary separatism. The terms of the New Left, or the fault lines of the New Left, seem not to correspond to those of the abolitionist revolution and its opponents in the 19th century. How did the experience of the politics of the 1960s shape your generation's approach, for good and ill, to the history of abolitionism, the early Republican movement, the Civil War, and its aftermath?
Well, I think that the Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin version of the civil rights movement powerfully shaped a generation of historians. I know it shaped my attitude toward the Civil War and Reconstruction. It was a liberal integrationist view that reinterpreted the abolitionist movement as a liberal integrationist movement in the 19th century, that reinterpreted Reconstruction as a noble effort to bring about a free and integrated society, that passed the constitutional amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that underlay the civil rights legislation of the 1960s and the voting rights legislation of the 1960s. And it saw, I think, that generation, or that historiographical tradition, of which I think I'm a part, saw the Reconstruction as a kind of a tragic failure of this liberal view that had real possibilities, but was undermined by Southern counter-revolution, if you will, and a northern kind of retreat from commitment to its goals, and that the civil rights movement of the 1960s was a second Reconstruction, and in fact was often called a second Reconstruction, that was now on its way to implementing those liberal goals and egalitarian goals of the first Reconstruction. I think that the movement toward the New Left, the Black Power movement, Stokely Carmichael and others in the later 1960s and 70s, rejected the whole idea that liberal integrationist movement in the 19th century and the abolitionist movement, the radical Republicans, ever had a chance to overcome white racism, that it was a false promise, that Reconstruction was not so much a tragic failure as it was something that never had a chance in the first place. And they kind of rejected the sincerity and genuineness of the abolitionists and the Republicans of the 1860s and 1870s as racists are only slightly better than the Southern rednecks, and that all of those ideals of liberal egalitarianism needed to be rejected, and that there needed to be a black revolution. And I don't think that affected as it had as powerful an effect in the historiography, but it certainly had a tendency to influence a good many historians in the 1980s, 1990s. Lerone Bennett's book on Lincoln as a kind of quintessential racist is just one example of that.